So, I have to admit guys, I was very wrong about this aircraft. Going into it, I assumed this was going to basically just be a beefed up Mirage 2000 with more thrust and more MICAs, but I quickly realized that the playstyle of hugging the deck, closing the distance, and knife fighting with the enemy team just does not really work with this airframe. The Fox 3 spam is just so pervasive that it's just simply impossible to dodge them all, even on the deck using multipathing, and also Fox 3's recently received a guidance buff, which I'll go over later in the video, which makes notching even more difficult than it used to be. Also, this thing will rip its own wings off at like Mach 1.2 on the deck, which is not particularly helpful when you're trying to dodge half a dozen Fox 3s and hug the ground as best you can. Given that its primary armament, the MICAs, are some of the shortest range Fox 3s in the game, this might make you think that this thing is basically just screwed, being unable to compete at BVR against weapons like the AMRAAM, while also being too badly hampered by its low rip speed to compete effectively at low altitude either. I'm happy to report though that I have found a strategy that will let you compete on even terms at high altitude BVR, and consistently do quite well overall. So stick around and I'll explain everything you need to know about this aircraft and how to use it effectively.
Just do it!
First, I want to just quickly explain something you're going to see me doing at various points throughout the video. Basically, the top tier Fox 3s have received a buff to their tracking, and there are already a couple of videos out there which do a better job explaining it in detail than I could, but just to break it down in very simple terms, these missiles act like AIM-9Ms now. Essentially, if you break the missile's lock with chaff, the missile will now assume that, since you probably didn't just go from supersonic to standing still instantaneously, it should look at your previous calculated flight path to try and reacquire you. This means that you need to chaff and change direction in order to dodge these missiles now. If you're in a Rafale though, this actually doesn't work out too bad for you, since being essentially a giant air brake with an absolutely ludicrous amount of thrust behind it, changing direction and speed is kinda this thing's specialty. On various occasions while playing this, I was able to dodge high-altitude AMRAAM launches from like 6 kilometers away, only to then turn the tables by using my helmet-mounted display and the MICA's thrust vectoring to quickly pop off a return shot and then go back into the notch. In spite of the range limitation of the MICAs, this thing is actually an extremely tricky opponent at high altitude if the pilot knows what they're doing. Speaking of which, let's get into this thing's other main strength, which is the MICA. So yes, the MICA has much shorter range than many of the other top tier Fox 3s, but as some of you know, it's incredibly fast in terms of acceleration, meaning that out to a certain distance, it will actually reach its target faster than just about any other missile. At lower altitudes, this oh shit, the MICA is coming at me very fast range, as I like to call it, is only a few kilometers, but when you're doing Mach 1.6 up in the stratosphere where I like to hang out, this range extends to about 20 kilometers or so. If you've mastered the art of notching, that kind of distance is more than enough of a buffer to dodge incoming AMRAAMs, and with a capacity of up to 8 MICAs, you have the ability to trade off shots for quite a long time. So, counterintuitively, once you get up to a certain altitude, that extra range on the AMRAAM starts to matter a whole lot less, and the MICA starts to become far more competitive, at least in the context of War Thunder air realistic battles. Now, this obviously brings up the problem of how you actually get up to that altitude without getting smacked out of the air by an AMRAAM first, but first let me just go over my preferred loadout. This is the part of the video where I need to apologize to the members of my audience with OCD or autism. I know there are a lot of you, especially the latter, because what I'm about to tell you will probably distress you all greatly. I do like to run an asymmetric loadout with this thing with 7 MICAs and 1 magic, reason being I rarely find myself in a situation where I need more than 1 magic, but it's very helpful to have at closer ranges since most people around this BR don't really check their surroundings for IR missiles and mostly just rely on their RWR. Anyways, let's get back onto the topic of how the hell do you actually make it to high altitude without getting force-fed an AMRAAM first. Well, it's actually pretty easy, most of the time at least. You see, most teams will have a bunch of people try to zoom climb right towards the enemy at the beginning of the match, and as a result, a lot of the enemy team will be rightfully prioritizing shooting those people down so that they don't get an altitude advantage. And it's this phenomenon that provides you with the perfect distraction you need to basically sneak up to high altitude around the side, which sounds extremely stupid, but does tend to actually work. On open maps, my preferred strategy is to climb at about 10 degrees on minimum afterburner out at about a 45-degree angle from the direction of the enemy team. This doesn't have to be exact, but generally I like to keep climbing until I hit either 10,000 meters or 30,000 feet, unless of course somebody decides to engage you, in which case focus on them first. The reason I don't go full afterburner as I'm climbing is that until you get to higher altitudes, you will rip in a shallow climb, so don't kick it to warp speed until you've gotten pretty high up. The other reason is that you don't want to be climbing too fast, since anyone experienced is going to most likely be targeting those at higher altitudes first, and you don't want to attract too much attention to yourself. There are a couple other advantages to climbing out wide like this, first being that the wide angle of this course will make it pretty hard for the enemy's radars to keep a solid track on you, so even if they see you, it's less likely they'll be able to get a solid lock. The other advantage is that since you'll be attacking the enemy force from side on rather than directly from the front, you won't usually be fighting more than one or two enemies at once, and in these sorts of BVR duels, the Rafale really starts to shine. Now, granted, sometimes you will get like one guy who sees what you're trying to do and aggressively singles you out, but this will only happen in a small minority of cases. Anyways, once you've cleansed the upper atmosphere of all of France's enemies, you can start working your way down to lower altitudes. Just be sure to watch your speed as you're doing this though, because as I've stated, but sometimes still fail to listen to my own advice, this aircraft has a very, very, very unreasonably low rip speed. Anyways, because the radar warning receiver display is laid out like a circle around the aircraft, there's just this like psychological thing most people have where they look around them when they start getting radar warning receptions rather than above them, which means firing your MICAs down on top of people works very, very well most of the time. Most of the time, once you've completed this routine, the match will most likely be over, but let me just give you a few words of advice in case you find yourself out of missiles and in a straight-up gunfight with somebody. I'm going to once again bring up rip speed, and genuinely I don't know what the hell the French were thinking when they designed it like this, but in any case, what it means for this aircraft at low altitude when you're out of missiles is that somebody can just run away from it and there's basically nothing you can do. That fact aside, the Rafale is, as you'd expect, insanely maneuverable with excellent acceleration, but will lose to a Eurofighter in a sustained energy fight. That being said, there's one very easy trick you can use that will allow you to basically get on anyone's 6 and stay there, and that's called the air brake. A lot of people seem to only really know to use this thing for the purposes of either forcing someone to overshoot or for landing, and don't really see it as a tool to use for like changing your speed. But for something like a Rafale, which has such a ridiculous amount of thrust and acceleration, you can basically use it to make sure that no matter what the enemy does, if they don't use it themselves, they're just not going to be able to dump enough speed in order to get behind you again. You're just going to stick on their 6. One other important thing to note is that on this particular aircraft, your radar gun sight is not going to do a particularly good job of showing you where exactly your shots are going to go. It seems to calculate the trajectory based off the assumption that your gun is centrally mounted, but because your gun is mounted low and off to one side, your shots are going to be hitting usually a bit low and to the right of the pipper. Speaking of the gun, it's kind of weird. It's a 30mm with an insanely high rate of fire, but it only gets sap rounds, which work pretty well when they connect, but it can be a little bit unreliable because it'll end up passing right through the aircraft if it doesn't hit a module. I only really got one good dogfight while I was doing the stock grind for this thing, and I hate to shortchange this guy because, in all honesty, he gave me a hell of a fight for like 2.5 minutes, but in the interest of brevity, I just wanted to show you here, I got a very solid burst into him, but it didn't really fully destroy his aircraft. I'm not actually sure if either it shot out all of his fuel or destroyed his engine, but in any case, you might have noticed that I actually disabled the radar gun sight because it kept messing up my aim, which is why I have such low ammo here, so I guess I should have just been eyeballing this from the start. Anyways guys, that's going to be all for this one. I hope you found this information helpful, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also check out more similar content in the end screen, and I'll see you guys in the next one.